Hey everybody, welcome back to Be Like Christ. We are studying Matthew chapter 23, at least the first part today. Regrettably, I had to divide this chapter again into two parts just because it's too long and I want to keep it in consumable chunks. But we're going to cover the first half today, and the second half will be in our next video. Remember, the notes for all the material that we're covering here are out on the website, and also grab a copy of the free ebook or the book on Amazon.com, What is the Bible, if you need some helpful information to get you started, if you're maybe a new Bible student or somebody who's helping somebody else study and you'd like a little bit of a framework. So that's available out there on the website. Go check that out. Let's see, I had one other thing to say and I can't remember what it was. Anyway, we're coming out of Matthew chapter 22, so Jesus has been challenged several times in Matthew chapter 22 by the Pharisees, by the Sadducees, and then he concludes chapter 22 with that question of his own that stumps the Pharisees about Psalm 110, I believe it is, where he talks about why does David call the Messiah Lord if David is his father, and you would think that his father would be not an inferior to his descendant, but a superior. Anyway, you can go back and check that out if you haven't already. Now, so Matthew chapter 23, Jesus is going to transition. He's just stumped the Pharisees and the Scribes and the Sadducees, and now this is his most severe condemnation of them. And the whole chapter is dedicated to that condemnation and to revealing to the people fully and as clearly as possible what he really thinks about them. And you got to think, some of the stuff he's kind of said in the past, but there's a new audience in front of him, at least mostly new, because the Passover crowd is in Jerusalem. So now they're all getting this information. We're going to see how they respond to that. Let's read verses 1 through 3. Then Jesus said to the crowds and his disciples, "The scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do, for they preach, but do not practice." So Jesus turns to his disciples in the crowd and he just lays into the religious leaders right off the bat. You got to imagine this scene. So Jerusalem is full of locals and Passover visitors alike. So it's super busy. And Jesus has been welcomed by these people as their Messiah just a few days before. They've said, this is the one who's coming in the name of the Lord, and we're behind this guy. Now their 30-year-old Messiah is just ripping on their religious leaders who they probably still had some respect for. And the reason I say that, it's difficult to know exactly what the Jews thought about the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the elders and the chief priests. But I think from passages like Matthew chapter 27, verse 20, that we can at least see that they had some respect for these people still. They may have known that they were a little bit corrupt, but they still had some respect because in a passage like that, they actually side with the chief priests and the elders in getting Pilate to release Barabbas instead of Jesus and having Jesus crucified. So evidently they at least still had some pull with the people. And if you don't know that story, we'll get to it in a few chapters. But so that it seems like at least many of them still have a lot of respect for this. And so how would they have still had respect for their religious leaders? So how would the Jews have responded to Jesus just laying into them here? I think that they might have responded in a couple different ways. Some may have thought, yeah, this guy's right. These people are corrupt, and we see their corruption in the temple when we go to offer our sacrifices. We have to get all of our money changed, or in the burdens that they lay on people, and the traditions that they hold us to that they shouldn't. Some people may have thought, this is the way that we would expect God to treat us if he sent us the Messiah or he sent us another prophet, because this is the way that he treated religious leaders in the Old Testament who were disobedient. But it seems like the majority of people, or at least a good portion of them, may have been turned off by the way that Jesus was talking here. I think that's interesting. I think the same thing can kind of happen to us. We may know that maybe something in our own house is not the way it should be. But when somebody from the outside attacks the people that we respect within kind of our own tribe, a lot of times we'll defend that person who we know is a little bit corrupt, but who's this outsider who's come to rip on our traditions and our old faith and our teachers, who we at least have some shred of respect for. It seems like some of that may have been happening here, and that's kind of what turns the people from when they were accepting Christ in as the Messiah in the triumphal entry, and then at the end of the week, they end up siding with the chief priests to have Jesus crucified. So that may have been some of the factors that played into that a little bit. Let's think about some application here. Even when religious leaders are exposed for hypocrisy or for greed or for any sin, just about any sin, you've probably noticed that may not be enough for some of their followers to actually abandon them. This is especially true with cult leaders or some false teachers or swindlers, and people respect them so much, not because the facts are necessarily on their side, but somehow they build up a respect with people, and no matter what they do, people won't abandon them. And a lot of the rest of us just scratch our heads like, why on earth would you stay faithful to this person, even though they've been exposed as a fraud? And the people who are their disciples, they'll believe just about any lie that comes out of their teacher's mouth, right, to cover up for what he's done. And they're like, oh, this is a witch hunt, or this is, the people who are reporting in this aren't faithful about it. All the facts are against them, but they're still faithful to that individual who they had respect for. That happens in politics too, but it happens in religion. And that may, here we see the religious leaders of the Jews being clearly exposed as frauds, and yet people don't entirely abandon them. On a more subtle level, though, when we think about an application, a lesson that we can learn from the context here is that we ought not to side with somebody on religious matters just because we respect them. Super important point. Many people practice religion a certain way because somebody that they respected told them that religion ought to be practiced a particular way. Whether that's a parent or a teacher or a friend who they respect, or maybe the person who first introduced them to Christ, or maybe the person who helped them out of the gutter when they were down in the dumps. And so they have respect and a relationship with a person. And so they practice religion based off of what that person says because of that respect. Sometimes people will stay faithful to a friend or a teacher or a parent in the way that they want them to practice religion, even against their better judgment, because they know that to walk away from that and maybe to do something else would be offensive to that person, or maybe even seen as a disrespect to that person. They value them so highly that they just continue doing things the way that that person wants them to do them. And our text is a great example of why that's a terrible idea and why you shouldn't do that. And I shouldn't do that. The Jews, the common Jews, using their better judgment, had accepted Christ into Jerusalem as the Messiah on Sunday, right? With the donkey and the palm branches and the clothing in the road. That was their conclusion, and we talked about that. They had concluded that this was the guy who fulfilled the prophecies and that he was the one who was coming to save them. He was the answer to their Hosanna cry. But by the end of the week, against that better judgment, they ended up siding with the chief priests and the elders and having Jesus crucified and being complicit with that decision. The reason? What was the reason? It wasn't because Jesus revealed himself, I didn't realize he's not actually consistent with the Old Testament scriptures. Not that Jesus revealed something in his teaching that was inconsistent with those scriptures. No, in fact, Jesus was just as consistent with those scriptures as the day they welcomed him in as the Messiah. The reason that they abandoned their better judgment is because their religious leaders convinced them to. Their religious leaders didn't like Jesus, and eventually they ended up working up the crowd enough to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus killed. Their direction was based on the people that they respected. And obviously there's some other factors in there as well, but their leaders were wrong, obviously, in killing Christ, and their respect was misplaced. And I think the case can be made that some of those people were honest people. They were honestly deceived by their religious leaders, because in Acts chapter 2, when Jesus is preaching about the church, and he's preaching to some of these Jews who had crucified Christ, they are remorseful about it, right? And they want to know what they can do to make that right. So they were honestly deceived by following somebody who they respected, who led them wrongly. And that's why it's important that we don't believe something just because it comes from somebody we have respect for. It's not to say that people's opinions and interpretations should not be evaluated, but we shouldn't just on face value accept something because somebody we respected believes it. It's a terrible idea. We need to search the Scriptures for ourselves to find out what's there, especially when it comes to something as important as our souls. There are some things in life you're just going to have to take people's word for it. Like, how does a microwave work? I don't know. Microwave raise, go pew, and all my food gets heated up, and I'm like, sweet. I don't know how that works. I just trust that the people behind it know what they're doing. and so many things in life are like that. But for all of us, one thing that we can't allow to be like that is in issues that pertain to our eternal life after this life is over. That's not... No one is going to be trustworthy enough for me to just take their word on that, especially considering I'm going to spend eternity in that place. So that's why a study like this is important, because we're going through the text of the New Testament ourselves. We'll be able to tell, okay, what I heard from that individual matches up or doesn't match up based off of what I know. I can go back to my notes and study it through and see, who's right and wrong. And that way I don't have to take somebody's word on it. And there's just so much. I think churches really, probably since the church began, have had a tendency to have this dependence culture. That you have your lay people and then your teachers, and your lay people just come to the teachers for their answers. And that's not the way that the New Testament really describes what our relationship should be to the Scriptures. So anyway, back to our text. We're not even through the first 3 verses yet. This is why this has to be a 2-part video. So back to our text. Let me go up and read it again, because you've probably forgotten it. The scribes and the Pharisees, this is verse 2, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do, for they preach, but do not practice. So this is the classic example of the parent who says, do as I say and not as I do. Moses was the original deliverer of God's message to the people. And in the community system that the Jews have in the first century, when Jesus is talking about that, the people who fit that role are the scribes, specifically, the Pharisees, as they talk about and interpret the law. And especially I don't think a lot of times we realize that not everyone was literate in these days. So it wasn't quite as simple as, hey, everyone go grab a Bible and figure this stuff out for yourselves. There was the Jews would have had, in a lot of ways, a dependence on priests, on scribes, on Pharisees to help them understand the law. And the problem is that the Pharisees are giving people a really bad picture of what that was. So we're so used to 99% of the population, at least in the United States, being literate. So you have to think about this in a little bit different context here. So he says they are filling that role that Moses had of supposedly communicating accurately the message of God down to the people. And he says, observe whatever they tell you. Observe whatever they tell you. And I think this probably has to be understood as a general principle rather than an absolute rule. And the reason is because we know that some of the things that the scribes and the Pharisees said were not in alignment with what God would have desired to be communicated through the law. So it's not as if they were 100% accurate on the law all the time, but I think what Jesus is saying is, so far as their teachings are consistent with Moses and the law as delivered faithfully by him, you ought to be obedient to what the scribes and the Pharisees are telling you. He tells them to observe says, observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do. So here's where we have that example of the parent saying, do as I say and not as I do. Follow my words and not my actions. Well, Jesus is saying that's what needs to happen with the Pharisees. Some of their words, and if they are accurately communicating the law, that ought to be heeded, but you should not act like them because they don't actually live out the things that they are teaching. The messages which came out of the scribes and Pharisees' mouths never translated into their lives, which is precisely why Jesus calls them hypocrites. Say one thing, do another. That's the definition of a hypocrite. I need a drink. Another application here, as we think about that. How difficult is it these days to find a church that is filled with faithful preaching, but also faithful practitioners? People teaching the scriptures accurately, but also practicing and putting those scriptures into application, being proper communicators and doers of the Lord's messages. If you look hard enough, you can find a church that teaches the Bible faithfully. Sorry, I got a text message, so now I'm thrown off. If you look hard enough, you can find a church that teaches faithfully, scripturally, and is has applicable preaching. I'm a mess. But you have to look even harder to find a church that has faithful preaching and a body of believers who then takes that out into the world and takes what they profess in the building and takes it outside of the walls of the building and lives it out. Those are actually, I would say, almost, I don't want to say exceptionally rare, but very rare these days. Those are hard to find. Like the Jews, the church needs leaders who will show them how to marry those two things together. And I think sometimes when we think about finding church leaders, and I use that term very broadly, very roughly, church leaders or Bible teachers in our congregations, we look for men who do a great job filling a pulpit or preaching a sermon or teaching a Bible class, or who are very eloquent or who are very studied. But we really need men to lead a congregation out into the world and take the principles that they've learned in the Bible studies and to take those out and to put them into practice outside of, the Sunday morning assembly. I think that's what the church is really lacking in a lot of ways. You can sit behind books and study and communicate that to people and communicate it well to people so that their heads are full of knowledge. But if that's never taken out and lived, then we're not really living Christianity, are we? And I think when we talk about the concept of taking what we learn outside of the Sunday morning assembly, it's interesting as you look back now, as we're almost all the way through the book of Matthew. We're getting close. We look back at where we've been and seen what Jesus has been communicating. It's interesting to notice and ask the question, how much of Jesus' ministry has been about what we do or the rules regarding that Sunday morning assembly? Because for a lot of churches, that's what it's all about, right? Sunday morning is the thing. That's what basically why you have a church. That's the main event. That is, if you show up to that, then you're good. Sunday morning has become almost everything to us, at least in a lot of places. Or maybe its value is so much higher elevated outside of the other Christian practices. But how much time does Jesus spend in the beginning part of Matthew talking about the Sunday morning assembly and what's supposed to go on there? The truth is, and you can look back on the notes if you don't believe me, the truth is hardly any. Hardly any. He's talking about the Christian life, the Christian heart, and living among men in relation, trying to communicate the gospel to them and the kingdom to them and the true heart behind it, what God wants you to be. That's not to downplay the Sunday morning assembly and say it's not important. It is important. But when we look at what Jesus has really been communicating in this gospel, he's talking about what goes on outside of those four walls, I think, primarily. And So when we look for leaders, or we look for congregations to attend, we need to look at people who can faithfully teach the Bible, but also who are faithfully practicing those things, and leaders who will help people in both of those areas and not just one. And there's a lot of congregations that are specialized kind of in one of those things, but not the other. And they really need to be married together to have the congregation that the Lord wants. Anyway, okay, now that I'm less flustered, let's finish this off. Verse 4 then. They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. You can see a picture of a man who's bent over here, who has a big burden on his back. I don't know if you've ever read the book Pilgrim's Progress, but that's kind of the theme of the beginning. He has this heavy burden that he's carrying. You can see this man, picture it in your mind. It has this heavy burden, and the Pharisees are behind him, laying packages after packages on his back of rigorous tradition that this man has to keep, in addition to the old law, which was in and of itself hard enough to keep. So here they're just adding to his burden. And he says that the Pharisees, they make these heavy burdens and put them on people, but they don't help them in any way. They're not going to be the ones who help them move them. So, they're communicators of the burden that people need to carry, but they are not bearing one another's burdens, as Jesus and as the apostles will tell us moving on in the New Testament. You think about that in contrast to Jesus then. Jesus bears the burden of the cross for us. That's the heaviest burden. And he's doing that for us. Contrast that with the Pharisees, who are just laying the burden on other people. Obvious difference there. As we've seen in our study, the Jewish leaders, their application of the law was harsh, and it was unconcerned with loving God and loving one's neighbor. The Old Testament law was difficult enough to keep, and the Pharisees made it even harder. A good example of this is in Mark chapter 2, verse 27. And that parallels the text of Matthew chapter 12, which we already talked about, where Jesus says that he's the Lord of the Sabbath, and he gets challenged because his disciples were picking heads of grain in the field, and the Pharisees are saying, you've profaned the Sabbath, and Jesus is saying, no, that's not the case. Well, in Mark chapter 2, verse 27, Jesus reminds the Pharisees that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath day was meant to ease men's burdens and their stress, but the Pharisees had actually made it a burden on men by creating all of these ridiculous rules that had to be followed. So here's Christ saying this is the true intention of God. It's to ease the burdens of men, and the Pharisees are actually just making it harder, and that's a shame. And the same thing can happen, with us, is that we can make it more difficult on people than it needs to be when we bind things that probably shouldn't be bound on people for them to be a part of the kingdom of heaven. Or we can be so rigorous on them in ways that we don't need to be, so that maybe they just decide, maybe this isn't for me. So, verse 5 then. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. So this is a really interesting passage, and if you couldn't pronounce that word that starts with a P, then that's okay, because that's probably not a word that you've encountered before if you've never studied the Bible before, unless you're into Jewish history. As we've mentioned, the Pharisees, their motivation is their pride, and they weren't as interested in praising God as much as they were about receiving praise from men. What on earth is a phylactery? This plays into that concept we just talked about. But what's a phylactery? I have some pictures there in your notes, which is why you should get the notes off the website of phylacteries. There's one with an Israeli soldier there, and you can see there's something on his head. Looks like a little box. And there's also something on his arm, something wrapped around his arm, and then there's the same little box that's on his arm there by his bicep. And then there is another picture where there's the box is actually being opened, and there's a little tiny scroll inside. So the phylactery, it's also known as a tefillin. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Tefillin. And it contains small rolls of parchment, which were written passages from the law of Moses, from the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And it's thought that the phylacteries were created in response to Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 18. That passage says, "You shall therefore lay up these words of mine in your heart and in your soul, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes." Most people took that in a figurative way. When God says, write these things these things should be before your eyes, and they should be a sign on your hand, most people think that means that they should be immediately in front of you at all times, like, what's in front of your eyes and your hands. You can always see them, you're always observing them, and so keep the principles of God always before you. But there were people who took it more literally and then created these traditions around what that meant and how these things needed to be practiced. And that's how we end up with this phylactery business. Archaeological evidence in Qumran, which is the same place they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, which have a lot of the manuscript evidence from the Old Testament, confirm the existence of these phylacteries in the 1st century, so in Jesus' day. The phylactery can have 2 parts. The first one is the small box that's worn on the head, and it contains passages of the Torah. You saw that on the guy's head we just pointed out on the notes. The second is the leather band that's wrapped around his forearm. He has it there on his left arm. And I was actually unaware of the second part until I was researching for this class or this study. And there's actually a lot of traditions around this that I didn't realize, but they play into the text here, and so this historical study is important. Additional traditions surround this phylactery business. There's debate that existed on the order in which the Torah passages had to be placed inside of the phylactery. So, whether they should have been chronological or whether they should have been in some other order. So it debated how those were supposed to be put into the actual little box. And there were also rules about the length of the leather arm strap and how many times it had to wrap around your arm. And I kid you not, there were rabbis who sat around and talked about this and wrote on it and made principles that this thing has to wrap around your arm 6 or 7 times, and it has to be this particular width, and it needs to come up to, or be wrapped around a particular finger, and a bunch of different stuff. One very interesting point, which is missed without the historical study, and I didn't know this, is that there are 4 passages that are contained in the phylactery. There's always 4. I thought they just wrote whatever they wanted, but there's actually 4. At least these 4 are in there. And it includes Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9. It also has Exodus chapter 13, verses 1 through 10, Exodus chapter 13, verses 11 through 16, and Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 13 through 21. And all of those passages, if I understand correctly, somehow mention this concept of keeping these laws in front of them, in front of their eyes and on their hands and in their hearts and things like that. So I mentioned first Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 through 9, and singled that out in the notes. And the question is, well, why is that one singled out? And it's because Jesus just quoted that passage. He quoted it in chapter 22 when the lawyer came up to him and asked him what the greatest command in the law was. That's Matthew chapter 22, verse 37. The Pharisees approached Jesus and they asked him about the greatest command in the law, and Jesus responded with Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5, and that is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. That was Jesus' response. What are they told to do with that teaching? I think it's interesting. What are they told to do with that teaching in Deuteronomy chapter 6? What the greatest command? What are they supposed to do with it? Deuteronomy 6 verse 8 says, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. The Pharisees and the Scribes literally had the greatest command sitting on their foreheads when they asked Jesus what the greatest command in the Old Testament was, and they completely missed it. They completely missed it. in their rigorous attempt to literalize all of these passages in the Old Testament, create all these traditions around them, and bicker over how long the strap on their arm needed to be, they had missed the question that they asked Jesus. What's the greatest command? Jesus could have said, it's sitting on your forehead. I mean, that's, that just astounded me when I realized that this was the case. Also in the rigorous attempt to keep this law literally, they had forsaken Deuteronomy chapter 6 verses, or particularly they had forsaken, what verse is that? Verse 6. Okay, so they had Deuteronomy chapter 6 verses 5 through 9 on their foreheads. Jesus has just talked about verse 6, and they've rigorously created these traditions around verse 6, but what they failed to do is what was contained in verse... No, okay, I messed that up. Let's try again. What was on their heads? On their heads was Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 5 through 9. Okay. The greatest command was contained in verse 8. I messed it up again. Will I edit this out? Maybe, maybe not. Okay. On their head was Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 5 through 9. And they always spent time arguing about verse 8, which was, what does it actually mean to keep these as frontlets between your eyes and written on your hands? And they had created these traditions around that. But while they were bickering about what was in verse 8, they completely neglected what was in verse 6. And that was, and these words that I command you today shall be on your hearts. The greatest command was sitting on their head and was wrapped around their arms, but they had neglected the command to put it into their hearts. And that, I think, of all the things that Jesus wanted them to talk about, that would have been the one. How do I get this into my heart? Not what does it mean to be on my head and on my arm. Pride and praise motivated them, and it is what motivates here the condemnation of Jesus. So you just see a little bit there about maybe why Jesus was as angry as he was, why he's going to spend an entire chapter here just ribbing on the Pharisees and the Scribes, is because these things should have been so obvious to them. They were on their head, and yet they wanted to bicker about the stuff that didn't matter instead of bickering about the important things. Understanding this passage also gives a little bit more insight into a passage that we'll encounter later on in Matthew chapter 23, and that is chapter 23, verse 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. Jesus says, you always arguing, you're very detailed in your religious traditions about these little things, but you are neglecting the big things that are clear in the law that you need to be doing. While they were busy arguing about the order of the parchment on their heads and the length of their arm strap, God and their neighbors were being forgotten. All right, then in verse 5, these fringes. What are these fringes? Now, every time I've read the passage about the woman with the issue of blood who comes up and touches the fringe of Jesus' garment, I've always just thought, maybe there was some phrase on the end of his robe. That makes sense. People weren't just buying clothes all the time. Or just, maybe they're just the bottom part of his garment. That may not actually be the case. There was actually a very specific fringe that I had neglected to know until now that was placed on the garments of Jewish people. Let's look at this. So he says that they make their fringes, what does he say? He says they make their fringes long in verse 5. This probably refers back to Numbers chapter 15, verse 37 and 40. And I'm going to read those few verses for you because if you're like me, you had forgotten about them or can't remember if I ever knew about them. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the people of Israel and tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a cord of blue on the tassels of each corner. And it shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all of the commandments of the Lord, to do them, not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes, which you are inclined to whore after. So you shall remember and do all my commandments, and be holy to your God." I forgot to put a picture in my notes here, but I'll add it before I put them online. Today, we see blue clothing everywhere. Blue is as common as any color. But back in this day, it wouldn't have been, because the dye was difficult to get. And just side note here, there's a bunch of scholarly debate about where the Jews would have gotten this dye from, and if it was extracted from an animal or from a plant. If you're fascinated with ancient dye methods, then you can go look into that some more. I specifically am not. But God told the Jews to wear these blue tassels to remind them of God's commands. Apparently the Pharisees and the Scribes, though, the Pharisees and the Scribes had made theirs especially large, and apparently the reason was so that they looked like they really cared about the commands of God. They really wanted to remember I can't talk. They really wanted to remember the commands of God, more than most people. So they had especially big tassels. Like, whoa, check out that guy's tassels. He must be way holy. That's not a phrase I've heard in the church today. Maybe I'll bring it back. And there were also traditions that surrounded the whole tassel business. The early rabbinic traditions specify the number of strings within the tassel that needed to be dyed blue. And some other rabbis even cursed people who used cheaper dye alternatives rather than the more expensive blue dye, because you weren't being as holy if you cheaped out on your tassels. And there was debate about the color that they were supposed to be, whether it was like more of a purple or an indigo or like a sky blue. And what I realized is that I've actually seen these tassels on Jewish people, but I didn't realize why they were that color. And actually, I was thinking about the Star of David. I'm not 100% sure on this, but that Star of David is the same color, that blue color, and that may actually be why. I don't know. I'll have to look into that some more. But that color is very important to the Jews, and honestly, I just thought they just like blue. And what they would do is that they would often, you might have a question like, how do they even get on these debates? Like, and what evidence scripturally, or what authority do they have to bicker over these tiny little details? Well, they would pull scriptural principles from all kinds of other places and try to use them to support their positions and apply them, or to say, oh, well, this principle exists over here, and it may not be directly related to this issue of tassels, but by implication, or we can apply a principle from that, and that really tells us how we ought to wear our tassels. So you've got a whole lot going on here, and not all of it's good. And it's not hard to see why Jesus is mad. Digging into the historical study helps us to understand why Jesus was as frustrated as he was. And without digging into the history, you'll just never see some of these points, which is why I'm glad to share them, because they have been really helpful to me and really illuminated this text as I've been looking at them. The Pharisees and Scribes weren't concerned about a man with a withered hand who was in the synagogue, but boy, oh boy, if you came in and you didn't have the right number of tassels dyed, or the right number of strings in your tassels dyed, you needed to repent because you're a bad Jew. Let's talk about some application now. It's easy to look at other people and be like, wow, they're really messed up. Now let's look at ourselves. This can happen in modern churches, and it does happen in modern churches. Christians can sit around arguing about things on which God has not been specific, and they can spend enormous amounts of time arguing about these things that God has not been specific on. And they will, like these rabbis, if God has not been specific, there's no specific command, right? But what they'll do, they'll take principles from all over the Bible and they'll try to, stuff them into that text and say, well, based on this principle that we should apply here, this is the way that we should do it. And oh, by the way, that makes it right or wrong, an issue of salvation or not an issue of salvation, because you have to apply this principle and drag it into this context. All the time that happens. It probably depends on the churches and the environments that you're familiar with, but I can promise you there are churches that get caught up on this. And let me just say that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Taking principles from other texts of the Bible and applying them to other places, if it is contextually acceptable, there's nothing wrong with that. And it ought to be done. But maybe we should consider if we are spending too much time doing that and too little time accomplishing the things that God has been specific about. I'm going to say on my notes, I'm not going to get on a soapbox. I'm not. And my question is this. If you find, well, for everybody to ask, would we care anything about the man with the withered hand in the synagogue? Would our church, if it was just our church collectively, would our church care anything about the man with the withered hand in the synagogue? Or would we be in the Pharisees arguing about the color of our tassels? And before you just give a knee-jerk response like, oh yes, of course my church would care, think about that and see if it's true. Let's bring it down to a personal level. Have I done anything for a handicapped person in my community or a poor person in my community? And an important question is, does the balance of my time go to accomplishing the greatest commands in the law? Or is the balance of my time spent in the back of a church building discussing minute issues or on Facebook debating nuances of the law? Like, where's the balance of my time go? Is it spent over here talking about all these things that God hasn't felt the need to talk about in his scriptures? Or is it spent doing the things that God has been clear about that we need to be doing as his servants? Most importantly, have I done anything for my neighbor who lives down the street from me or who works with me, who by my own confession is going to end up in hell if he doesn't know about Jesus? Have I done anything for a person like that? Because if the answer to that is no, but I've spent a whole lot of time discussing doctrine, then there's a problem with that. Then I'm more of a, count the tassels. How many tassels do you have dyed kind of a Christian than a Christian who's out fulfilling the greatest commands? In a lot of ways, we may fall into the category of having the greatest commands plastered on our buildings and on our signs and on our Bible covers, and we talk about it in our church buildings, but we never go out and do it. It's plastered on our head and wrapped around our arm, and we carry the book with us, but it's not in our heart. We neglected verse 6, never sinks down into our hearts so that we actually go live that stuff out. But oh man, if you want to debate doctrine, bring it on. And I don't say that to be critical of people. I say it mostly because I feel like I'm trying to work myself out of being that person. The most natural thing in the world, the easiest thing in the world for me is just to sit down and debate some nitpicky doctrinal position on some hypothetical doctrine or hypothetical situation, and we gotta determine what's right and what's wrong. Like that, to me, it comes very naturally. And I walk down the street and I see people who are going to hell, and I'm like, and I don't do anything. And when I look at my life and think, which category do I fall most into? I'd have to confess that a lot of times I fall into the first category. I fall in with the Pharisees. And I spent a lot of time talking about stuff, talking about religious things. But how much of that has gone down into my heart, and how much of that is if the Lord looks at us on Judgment Day, and what's he going to be pleased with? Is he going to be like, man, you spent 3 years of your life discussing that doctrine that I wasn't clear about, but you figured it out. You figured out the right answer. And congratulations, you get to go into heaven. Or is he going to say, you spent your time in care for others and in love for me and in reaching the lost and in caring for your neighbors and showing my love and reflecting my love in the world. Which one's he going to be happy with? I got to think that it's really the second. And that's not a downplay on doctrine. As you know, I have never de-evaluated. No, that's not the word. I've never devalued doctrine. Doctrine is important. That's why we're here studying through the whole New Testament. But being a guy who talks about, quote, doctrine all the time, and a guy who never goes out and actually puts that doctrine in your heart to be convicted enough to go speak to anyone or to go out and actually try to reach somebody who's lost. Like, if that's the position that we're in a bad position. And if you feel like I harp on this all the time, it's probably because I'm preaching at myself. And I also know a lot of people who are in this position with me. This is why Jesus spends so much time talking to the Pharisees. This is a legitimate problem. And we as Christians need to be about accomplishing the greatest commands. All right. Enough of that. Next application. Is it possible to be surrounded in religious practice and scriptural study and to have no affection for God? Answer, yes. To be surrounded by all things religious and not know God and not have a relationship with God. The Pharisees did it every day, didn't they? They had the scriptures on their foreheads, wrapped around their arms, hanging off the corners of their garments to remind them who they were supposed to be. And yet they didn't love God and they didn't know God. And Jesus told them as much. You don't know God. You don't know me. You don't know God. An example of that is, consider a child who grows up in a faithful church, faithful parents, and he or she grows up attending Bible class, reading the Bible, participating in church activities, singing, praying, and as soon as that person leaves the house, their faith just evaporates. It's gone, and they go off and have no more interest in serving the Lord. How does that happen? Well, it's because they were good at religious practice, but the deeper meaning behind those practices, they were never appreciated. A person can be surrounded by beautiful things and never come to appreciate those beautiful things. And Christians can go through the motions, but observing somebody in motion doesn't necessarily reveal everything that we need to know about that person. Revealing somebody going through religious practice doesn't mean that you understand everything about that individual and whether or not they're pleasing to God. I think, unfortunately, a lot of times we equate those two, and they're not an exact fit. That puzzle piece doesn't exactly match up. Sometimes it does. A lot of times it does, and that's good. But you can go through the practice and be rigorous about going through the practice and not have any relationship with God at all. I think we really need to be praying that God would open our hearts to accept the truths behind the practices. And no doubt he will do that if that's really our desire. And part of the way we do that is by going into the scriptures and seeing the beauty that's contained in them, not just the commands, I guess. Ooh, that's another soapbox I could get on. You have to look at the Bible to see the beauty behind it, not just the do thises and do that's. Let's say that for another video. So that's going to be the first part of our chapter study in 23. I don't know why I am not speaking well today, but thanks everyone for hanging in. And the notes will communicate it much better to you if you want to just go out and read those and ignore my audio here. So remember, go out, get the notes, get the book online. What else did I have to say? Can't remember. Subscribe, comment, like, share the video, do all of that stuff. And I'll see you guys for part 2 of chapter 23 in 2 days. Bye.